Today I'm using a transparent base to help my images pop. Hello there, Michelle Short here with Terrific Tags with Michelle. I'm here on the Altenew YouTube channel on the first and third Saturday of the month. So if you enjoy my videos, I'd love for you to subscribe. So let's get started. I'm using the Build a Garden Rose Reverie set today. It's a really beautiful image of two roses with leaves. There are the coordinating dies and also the coordinating stencils in this set. You do also get a mini blending brush as well. So I'm going to start off by stamping my image. I have placed a piece of Classic Crest 110 solar white cardstock into my stamp wheel, and now I can place my stamp over the top. I can then bring in the top flip plate and pop that in place to pick up that stamp. You don't need to press as much as this to pick up that stamp. It will stick pretty easily, but for some reason I was pressing a little bit too much. I'm then going to ink up my stamp using Obsidian pigment ink. This is a really lovely dark crisp ink. Because it is a pigment ink, it does take a little bit longer to dry than a dye ink, but as pigment inks go, it does dry really pretty quickly. So I've inked up that image. I can then turn over that plate and press that down. And with the stamp wheel, I like to sort of get the bottom corners in place first and then go around the top corners and then press the image down onto that cardstock. And I did get a pretty good impression the first time. I do like to double stamp my images just to make sure that they're really nice and dark lines. So I'm just inking that up again. I can then flip over that plate and stamp it down for a second time. And then I am just going to set that aside just for a couple of minutes for that ink to dry. So we've got a really lovely image here that I can add some ink blending on top to colour it in. So I'm using the coordinating stencils, and on the back of the packaging it does tell you which order you might want to use them in. If you did them in a different order, it wouldn't really matter, but it is just quite helpful having that on the back of the packaging. So I'm starting off with stencil 1. Now ordinarily with stenciling I would use my sticky mat and hold the stencils down onto that as well as the image, but I haven't cut this out yet and these stencils are a little bit on the smaller side, so there's not going to be much of a gap to be able to stick them down onto the sticky mat, so I'm just using some low tack tape to hold these down today. I'm going to use the Deep Blue Seas Fresh Dye Ink collection to colour in my roses. Now blue isn't a traditional colour for roses, but I absolutely love blue roses, so I'm going with that today. These inks are a little bit more on the kind of turquoisey side, which I really like. So I'm starting off with the lightest shade and a mini blending brush, and I want to focus the darker colour onto these petals at the base of the petals and then lighten up as I get to the tip of the petal. So I like to bring in my brush to where I want the darkest area to be, and then as I go along to the end of the petal, it's automatically going to lighten up because I haven't got so much ink on that brush. I do like to dab off the excess ink from my brush onto usually some scrap paper. Now if you're new to ink blending, the reason for doing this for me personally is that I feel that I get a slightly smoother blend by doing it this way. Everyone has their different techniques of what they prefer, but for me I like to do it this way. Ideally I would add the ink kind of into the lid of the ink pad, and that means that I can then pick up that ink again and reuse it instead of wasting that ink on the scrap paper. Unfortunately, I'm that kind of person who just likes to have all of their products be pristine, so I would end up cleaning off that ink anyway, and so for me I may as well just use a piece of scrap paper. But I did just want to mention that in case you're not one of those kind of people and you would be able to reuse that ink. So I'm switching over to a micro blending brush now because I want the darker shades to not come out as far, and these petals are quite small, so it's quite nice to switch to a smaller brush to get in those smaller areas. So this is the second to darkest shade in this ink collection, and again I'm focusing this ink towards the base of these petals. And I just love how these colours all blend really nicely together. The darker blue that I'm going to add on in a minute is really quite a lot darker than these colours, but they do all blend really nicely together. So just adding that darkest shade into the base of these petals here. I find that going in this way just makes the petals look a little bit more realistic, so you've got some shadows and highlights. But they don't necessarily need to look realistic. This is card making. In the case I'm today is tag making. But the great thing is that you could do all sorts of different colour combinations here. You could add lots of different shades onto these petals. I do tend to kind of go with one shade, like in the case here I'm doing blue. But I do like to add in that depth with those darker shades. So I'm going in with this darkest shade here again and adding in that darker shade towards the base. And some of these I do go over twice just to make sure that that's really nice and dark. When these inks dry, they do tend to dry a little bit lighter. So I know that I want to go in slightly darker than I think is going to end up at the finished image. And because I know that I'm going to go in with a slightly lighter shade on these brushes, I'm just going to kind of rub that off onto a cloth there. And that's just going to remove that excess ink so that when I go in next with a lighter shade, I'm not going to get a darker shade than I actually want. So I can remove that low tack tape and lift off that stencil. And I really love how that's starting to look. So I can bring in the second stencil here in the set, place that over the top, and then do the same with the ink blending. And I wish in real life it went this quick, but I have sped this up for the video so that you didn't need to see me do lots and lots of ink blending, because I'm just doing the exact same thing on all of the petals there. So that was stencil 2 and 3, and now this is stencil 4. So I can do the exact same thing for these petals here. They are getting smaller in size, so I'm just being careful here with how much ink I add on, because I do still want to try and keep that white highlight at the tip of the petals. So I can just go in here again with that darkest shade, just adding a little amount of that where I think that the parts of these petals would be a bit darker. And there are leaves on this stencil, so I'm going in with my favourite greens, which are the Greenfields Fresh Dye inks. I've got all 4 here, but in the end I only end up using the kind of lightest 3. So I'm going in with a mini blending brush again, adding in a base layer of this lightest shade. And again I'm focusing the darker colour towards the base of these leaves. And I decided that I wanted these leaves to be fairly light. I thought it'd be quite a nice contrast with the darker flowers. So I can go in here with the second shade, again focusing that colour towards the base of these leaves. And then I can finish off with what will be my darkest shade, but this is the third darkest in the set. I can lift off that stencil, and then I've got the last one to add on top. So I started off this time with the leaves. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing, add a base of that lightest shade, and then go in with the 2 mid-tones. And again, I'm just using the mini blending brush at this point. And then I do switch to the micro blending brush just to get into those smaller areas. And I thought at this point that I wouldn't have contamination of the colours on this stencil because I'd use the smaller brushes. But you can see there that there was some green on that stencil, and I picked it up with that brush. So the inside of my flower now looks a little bit more on the green side. So I'm just using a cloth there to remove the excess ink from that stencil. And I'm going to go back in, I'm going to clean my brush so that I don't contaminate the next lot that I add on top. And then I can go back in, and for quite some time it does look a little bit off the colour. It doesn't look the same as what it would have done if I hadn't have had that green on there. But as time goes on, I'm going to add in a lot more darker colour onto this, and it kind of covers up that green little bit. Thankfully, the inside of roses do tend to be quite a bit darker, but I did probably go darker than I ordinarily would have done. But it looks okay in the end, I think. So I can just finish off with that darkest blue. And then I can lift that off, and I think they just look so pretty, those roses. I'm then going to bring in the coordinating die. I can place that over the top of the image and hold it down with some low tack tape. I can then run that through my die cutting machine and pop out that image. I do then want to cut this down into a tag. I'm creating a tag today, but you could definitely do this on a card as well. I'm not going to lie, a little bit reluctant to cut this down. Unfortunately, I just cannot fit this image onto a tag, and so I'm going to cut the edges off of this image here. And like I say, at this point I was quite reluctant, but I didn't want to just have one rose on this tag. I did want you to be able to see a little bit of each of them. You don't see a huge amount of the one on the left, but it is just quite nice to have them kind of there, I suppose, if that makes sense. I didn't just want to have the one on the right hand side, but I think that looks so nice, that little piece that I cut off, so I'm going to keep it and see if maybe I might use it for something else. I do want to place this onto an acetate tag. If you were doing a card at this point, you can grab a piece of acetate and either fold it in half like you would a card base, or you can purchase acetate card bases now, which is really helpful. So I've taken the largest tag in the Terrific Tags die set. I've placed that down onto my acetate here, and my acetate does come with this parchment paper in between the sheets, which is really helpful because I'm going to use that to help me get a clean cut. If you didn't have that parchment paper, you could just use a piece of scrap paper, but having something underneath the acetate not only helps to prevent getting any kind of cut marks on the acetate when you run it through the die cutting machine, but it also helps to get a really nice clean cut. So I'm just running that through my die cutting machine here, and it did cut really nicely. So I can just remove that, and as I lift it off, it's going to remove all of the outside in one piece, which was nice. And then I've got my acetate tag here. And like I say, it did cut really nicely. There's just a couple of little pieces here that you would do if you were to cut cardstock. Sometimes you have those little fibres hanging around. It's the same kind of thing. So I just use my scissors there just to remove those. And now I can add some instant dimension foam tape onto the back of my image piece here. I can then remove the backings off of that and adhere that down onto my tag. So I'm just being really careful here to try and line this up as best as possible. Because I'm using that foam tape, I pretty much only have one chance here. So I was just trying to be as careful as possible. I did kind of not get it quite right at the bottom, so I'm just going in with my scissors here and just cutting that little bit of the image off there at the bottom. Now the downside of using a clear base is that you can see all of that adhesive through it, and it doesn't particularly look that nice. So I need to cut another piece of this die here, and I'm going to cut it so that I've got a scrap piece of cardstock underneath. That's going to help prevent getting any kind of cut marks onto the back of this piece, because I need to use the back of it rather than the front of it, because this isn't a symmetric image. If it was symmetrical, then like a circle or a square or something like that, then I could use the front of it. But for this, I need to use the back of it. When you die cut, you do get that really nice kind of rounded edge in the sides. Obviously, I'm not going to get that because that's on the other side. So I'm just using my bone folder here just to try and push those edges down a little bit. And that does help a little bit, but in the end I decide to put it in between some scrap paper and then run that through my die cutting machine, and that's just going to press those edges down a little bit, and so it looks a little bit nicer. So that did flatten it a little bit. And then I can just figure out here where I need to place it on the back, and I had it upside down to start with. It did take me a little while to figure out where this was supposed to be placed. So now I've got the placement here, just making sure that that's going to line up nicely. I could have cut it into a tag, but I wasn't 100% certain if I was going to get it in the exact right place. So I thought it would be easier for me just to add some glue tape onto this piece. So just making sure that I'm covering this really well. A lot of it is going to get cut off, but I don't know at this point which parts of it are going to get cut off. So I'm just covering it completely in that glue tape, and then I can line it up on the back of this tag. So I'm kind of like holding it up here. I found that was just a little bit easier for me to do it. And I didn't get it quite right the first time, but I did manage to just have enough time to lift this off and then pop it back down again. So before I press it down, I'm just going to check on the front, make sure that that's lined up nicely. And then once I'm happy, I can press that down. I can then bring in my scissors here and just cut off the excess from the sides. And I like using quite long scissors for this. I just find it a little bit easier to get a nice clean cut. Now obviously if you were creating a card with this and you didn't have anything overhanging the sides, you wouldn't need to do this part. I would just have the whole image probably in the centre of an acetate card base, and then I could just use the other piece to stick on the back, and that would be a little bit easier. So I've now got a really nice clean back to my tag, and I can write a personal message on there if I want to. I have stamped and heat embossed a sentiment from the Rose Reverie set, and I've cut that down into a strip, and I can adhere that down with some instant dimension foam tape. And then to finish off, I'm adding some ivory pearl dots. This took me a little while to figure out exactly where I wanted these to be. I kind of placed them down and then lifted them off, changed my mind. You do want something, if you're adding it onto the acetate, that's going to look okay from the back. Something like pearls, or that have already got the adhesive on, or like enamel dots or something like that. You wouldn't necessarily want to use sequins because you would add the glue onto it and then you probably would see the glue from the back. So it's nice just to have something with the adhesive already on it, and then it's going to look neat from the back as well. So that is the tag finished for today, and whilst you don't see a huge amount of the acetate poking through the sides, I do think it looks really pretty. I kind of did something similar with a floating tag not that long ago, but it's quite nice to have the standalone tag with the acetate as well. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar on YouTube and also over on the Altenew blog. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Wait, we have more where that came from. If you're after fabulous card making tutorials, you are definitely in the right spot. Our amazing design team create and upload fabulous video tutorials right to this YouTube channel. If you don't want to miss another amazing crafting tutorial, don't forget to subscribe and click that fun red button that you can see. Let's become paper crafting experts together.